Put it on the cloud.
Oh, there we go.
We'll do that. It'll be fine.
That's
So,
working. Okay.
Nick, so wonderful to be with you. Thank you so much for joining us. And I think what would be amazing as an introduction to this is to tell us your story. Tell us a bit about yourself and how you got to this point.
Sure. Well, first and foremost, thanks for having me. Happy to be with you and your audience. This will be fun. I'm happy to share my story. Like I think probably plenty of people don't love talking about myself, so I'll keep it short. I'm not that interesting anyway, but the kind of quick version of it is the quick version is 12 years old, something like that, right? Somewhere around sixth grade here in the US. Was a pretty good soccer player, right? What you would know as footballer. And just remember taking my little sister. I have two younger sisters, right? Took my baby sister out into the driveway. She had a game that day, showed her a couple things. She went out and had a great game, right? And so, correlation, causation, but correlationally, I looked at that and said, oh, I did that, right? Or I caused that. And I just remember really distinctly that was a good feeling, right? And that, I think, planted a seed. By the time I was 14, 15, I did a nice job shadow with an uncle who worked in sports and athletics, but in school. So we had these really awesome relationships with kids my age, right? And I had a good relationship with them that I kind of saw as similar to the experience with my sister, right? And then I had awesome teachers where I went to school and good relationships with them. So naturally, I kind of said, all right, I want to do more of that, right? I want to help people level up, and in particular young people, so I'll go into education, right? So did that. I'm sorry for generalizing here, but I'm gonna say, like many teachers, it wasn't exactly what I think we had hoped it would be or expected it to be, or certainly see room for potential. I loved what I did, but there was a lot of room for growth. That eventually led to, I'm going to go back and get my master's because I've got this intellectual itch that I've got to scratch, right? How do we make this thing better? Because I've been in some of the poorest of poor schools, public schools, private schools, the wealthiest of the wealthiest, and most kids are dealing with the same sort of issues, which is this is not a very pleasant experience or endeavor for them, right? And you talk about various studies like 2015, Mark Brackett talks about the 75% of the words kids use to describe their school experience are negative, right? So I'm loving what I'm doing, loving the kids, but I want to, like most young idealistic teachers, I want to fix that, right? Mm-hmm. So go back for my master's, no answers there, but I stumble upon Sir Ken Robinson's famous TED Talk, Do Schools Kill Creativity, right? Which I think is still the #1 TED Talk of all time in terms of views. And that was sort of that moment, like, okay, that's it. He's got it. He's talking about what is like kind of gutturally in my head, right? Maybe intuitively in my head, but not explicit. And he really helped make it clear for me. So that led to going back for my PhD. PhD is in educational psychology and ed tech. That opened up the world of positive psychology, human flourishing, intrinsic motivation, the flow state, right? All these different elements or components of what I might call a good life or a flourishing life, right? So now I take that science, I try to apply it to really, I call it 4 E's: elite athletes, educators, and entrepreneurs and execs. And then our podcast, Flourish FM, right, is for everyone. So.
Amazing. Wow, what a story, Nick. Thank you so much. And your Flourish FM podcast is outstanding. I absolutely love it.
Thank you so much.
I look forward to every episode so much. So everybody, please Google Flourish FM and listen to Dr. Nick Colton and Dr. John Beale interviewing some incredible people really beautifully as well. So yeah, couldn't recommend that more highly. And Nick, what I'd love to know, what were the key lessons to fall out of your PhD research? Because, when we do a PhD, it's a lot of thought, a lot of time, a lot of energy, a lot of effort. What were the key lessons you learned from it?
Yeah, I'll give you a personal lesson and a professional lesson. Okay? So the personal lesson is, so I used to have a principal I worked for who referred to a doctoral degree as the study of a gnat's, for your audience, we'll say arse. Okay. So what did he mean by that? Really, really, really tiny and minuscule and specific in terms of research topics, right? So my personal takeaway, first and foremost, was sort of epistemological. If it takes this much time and energy and effort to know so much about this tiny little thing, imagine how little I know about everything else, right? So it's like the inverse of ignorance is bliss sort of deal. Not that I'm not ignorant, but you catch my drift, right? But the professional takeaway was, so my dissertation was on eudaimonia, right? However you might hear it pronounced. And to the extent to which, excuse me, that young people were experiencing it in classrooms at the school I was teaching at that time, right? I think like many PhD students, we don't necessarily look at our dissertation and think high quality work. So take what I'm about to say with a grain of salt. And kind of the spoiler here is I didn't find a lot of eudaimonic flowy experiences in classrooms. Where I did find it seemed to sort of support a lot of the theory and the sort of conceptual frameworks you would see under things like flourishing and well-being and purpose and meaning and interest and all those sorts of things, right? So, that's what I studied, and that I haven't really come back to that question. I think now it's expanded from just eudaimonia to flourishing more holistically.
Oh, wonderful. So interesting. And, it's heartbreaking to see these kids. We've got them for hours and hours and hours every day. In the UK, many students, most students are with us for 13 years of their lives, possibly even more. And you just think we've got to give them that flow experience. We've got to enable them to flourish in a eudaimonic way. It's so important. And Gallup's got obviously massive data sets on engagement, and it's really profound. The drop off from kindergarten or year one, whatever you want to call it, first grade, comes down, and the teacher's flourishing or the teacher's engagement is even worse, which is mildly terrifying for an education system. And it leads me on beautifully actually to the next question. What does flourishing mean for you?
So, I think I probably align with a lot of different folks around the world on kind of like two primary components. So I think you'll hear this out of New Zealand, you'll hear it out of Australia. I think you all might align with it a little bit, right? You'll hear it commonly in the US, other parts of the world. Generally feeling good and functioning well. Okay. So you can play with the synonyms for that. When I say generally feeling good, this is a really, I think, important nuance, emphasis on generally, not perpetually. Okay. Like a lot of the research on psychological well-being, subjective well-being, life, all the things, right, involve some presence of unpleasantness, right? And there's some utility in unpleasantness and those sorts of things. But generally feeling good, right? And that can facilitate functioning well, which to me means, whether you call it optimal performance, peak performance, I like optimal because peak is, you're oscillating. Optimal is doing the things in between that help you oscillate, right?
Nice.
So optimal performance in directions that are meaningful, that are self-concordant, right? That are values driven, those sorts of things. That is how I think of flourishing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love that you've brought up that you don't have to have positive emotions the whole time, and actually embracing the full spectrum of the human experience, which does mean occasionally experiencing suffering. And that's okay, because exactly as you say, utility can come from that. It can be a real opportunity for growth. It can be an opportunity for gratitude, for connection. So it's great. And it's probably a criticism that we've seen of positive psychology, which I think is actually unfounded. I think in most cases it's a misunderstanding or a misrepresentation in the media, because I don't know any good quality positive psychologists who would ignore the utility of the negative emotions or accept the fact that you will experience them in life, and it's much more how you work through them than
I think you're right. I've seen it explained, I can't remember what it was, podcast, book, article, something like that, as sort of, pause psych 1.0, 2.0, 3.0. And 1.0 was very like, there's a lot of utility in pleasant emotion. It's Barbara Fredrickson's Broad and Build and, flow and all these sorts of things, right? And it's a lot of internal locus of control. Cognitive behavioral techniques, and your perspective matters, and the reality you take, and very like Viktor Frankl, right? All of that's great. And for certain populations, that doesn't resonate, right? And so I think it evolved to 2.0, which is, well, We're not saying always pleasantness, but there's a place and utility for both. And by the way, your ecosystem matters as well. It's not all internal locus, right? So I think when we think about flourishing and some of the criticisms of positive psych, I think you can bring all this together. And the way I talk about it is like, when we think of flourishing, there's top down, starting in the head, there's bottom up, right? Physiologically or somatic, and then there's outside in. What's the environment, the ecosystem, right? Which jives really well with different conceptualizations you'll see of flourishing or well-being also.
Yeah, absolutely, because nearly all of them include relationships. And actually, interestingly, Bob Fredrickson's most recent book, Love 2.0, which is a really excellent read, is all about relationships. And it's almost impossible for me to flourish if you're not flourishing. You know, it's something that we do in community. The extent to which I'm flourishing, experiencing positive emotions, faring well, doing well, is going to affect everyone around me. So actually, it's a community endeavor flourishing rather than an individual endeavor. So we can work on ourselves, and we also need to appreciate the impact we have on others, but also that others have on us.
So that just yesterday, you mentioned my co-host for the podcast, John Beal, who I know is doing a couple episodes of this for you as well. Just yesterday, we interviewed Lucy Hone and Denise Quinlan. Do you know Lucy and Denise?
I know Denise, actually. I've met Denise. Wonderful. Yeah, but not
Great.
Lucy. I've not met Lucy.
Wonderful, brilliant, scholars and practitioners. And they're doing a lot of work on some of the differences between resilience or grieving, or, grieving and being resilient, and collective resilience, right? So we're digging into all these different topics. So they've got all sorts of interesting lines of research. And it really bridged with what we're talking about today, because they mentioned new sort of, I believe there was just a Templeton grant given to study flourishing during adversity, right? Or flourishing during adverse experiences. Maybe Boston, Lucy said Boston Uni, something like that. But yeah, so a lot of interesting connections, and it seems like the world is really starting to frame, I at least get the sense we're framing these concepts a little bit more consistently, right? And getting a little bit more aligned with, it doesn't have to all be this thing and none of that thing, right? Like there's some nuance in here that really resonates, I think, with human experience.
Yeah, I think the nuance matters so much, because actually what every single individual that I've ever come across needs to flourish is a little bit different. So you can certainly generalize, and they're doing that beautifully in the Global Flourishing Study, which is led by Harvard and Baylor universities. And that's really, really helpful that we do have those domains that most scholars would agree are important. But actually, when you look at it on an individual or a team or a community level, it's really, really important to dig into the nuances and really understand what flourishing means for that individual, for that team of people together, for that community together, rather than saying, this is this. And I guess the other issue of the big measures is that meaning and purpose is likely to be different for me than it is to you, than it is to someone else. So actually really getting an understanding of what brings me meaning and purpose and you meaning and purpose is really important to enable us both to flourish. And ideally, we find areas of congruence if we're going to work together, live together, and then we work on it together. But I think that nuance is really important, and appreciating the individual within the collective.
And that's the issue with education, right? Like to bring this back there, I mean, like I can appreciate that's the tension. I understand if anyone would disagree with how I feel about what education is or how it should go. I get like, well, there's a greater good here. I don't want to live in a dumb society or society without X skills or whatever. But I'll go down that road with people as well and say, like, I'm not sure those are the skills that we're still building anymore, right? So even if you separate that from flourishing, there's an argument to be made. But yeah, that's the tension, is like and I've talked to like Scott Barry Kaufman about this. He's got a lot of different ideas here. When you talk about, he likes the phrase human-centered education. He and I got into this a little bit on the psychology podcast. It's beautiful, right? It makes a lot of sense. How do we help young people self-actualize? That's a lot of time and resources, and getting into boundaries around who gets to determine values and belief systems and culture, right? Like there's a really complex mixture there. So I don't pretend that it's easy to sort of siphon off and filter through. It's a complex problem.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess that leads us to think, okay, so if I were to ask you what is the purpose of education, and maybe gave you a job in the Ministry of Education or whatever you call it, Department for Education, what would you be saying the purpose of education is?
So to me, if you're talking about well-being, whatever that means, let's use it very generally, right?
Yeah.
Well-being and performance, okay? Whether it's on an individual level or a collective level, I think you've got a two-directional relationship. You got a little bit of the chicken and the egg, right? So to me, if I want to create the best possible societies with the best quality of life for future generations, I want young people who can harness all the different elements of the science of human flourishing, right? Again, that does not necessarily mean constant pleasantness. So counterintuitively, I often get sort of weird looks when the pause psych flowy well-being guy kind of says, hey, you might need to induce a little bit more unpleasantness. Like, I'm not a self-esteem movement, everybody gets a trophy kind of guy either. Like, there's a practical reality that life is hard. It's going to be hard. You're going to experience unpleasant emotion. You should, right? Kind of the yin and yang on a Lemke, right? Teeter totter, pleasantness, unpleasantness. Like, that's part of the human experience. Let's practice that. And let's do it in a safe environment. Let's do it in schools, and let's do it through sports, and let's do it through learning musical instruments and all the things, right? But that should always be underpinned by a focus on well-being and strengths, and where young people can really grow to learn something they love, crush it, right, in terms of performance, and get the best of both worlds. And I think eventually, embedding that within a sense of purpose and community and belonging, right, and all the altruism that can potentially go with that, and the giving behaviors and sort of big potential behaviors, right, all of those can be done really synergistically. That's what I would like to see out of at least the system here in the United States. Obviously I feel that way pretty much everywhere, but definitely the US for now, right? So like, bring the best out of people. That's the simple way to say it, right? Not skills, but the best out of people, the way they behave, the way they interact, and the way they manage their health and performance.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is such a huge topic. And I think we could probably speak for days and days and days on how we do that. So
absolutely,
what I'd love to do is to drill down into one particular area where we could make a change, which is of interest, certainly to educators and people outside education as well, who are hoping to influence the education system to raise young people who are better able to thrive and flourish in the world and make a positive contribution. So, and that would be curriculum. How would you embed more flourishing or more opportunities to empower young people to flourish and develop to flourish into a curriculum?
So to me, there's probably layers of questions here, right? Number one, always with curriculum design, what's the purpose, right? What's the goal? What are we actually trying to accomplish or have these young people accomplish? To me, that could be, let's call it like academic content basis. So some underlying knowledge, some academic skills, right? And at the same time, learned experiences and psychological skills because of those academic endeavors. So persistence and grit and discipline and distraction management, right? Which can all play a part in well-being, okay? Goal setting and, obstacle identification and whoop goals and all those sorts of things, okay? So you've got these sort of like soft skills, if you will, that can come from the academic skills. First and foremost, I would question which of those is more important, right? And then as you identify those strategies and priorities, and obviously you can guess which way I lean, right? What I would want to see is curriculum that is designed that prioritizes some of those soft skills, right? And it's not an either or, it's a both and takes those academic topics or content and makes them self-concordant in some way, right? Figures out a way to reframe for students so that they feel autonomous. Figures out a way to coach and work with students so that they can connect it to their sense of meaning and purpose. Figures out a way to know their students well enough so that they can tap into their interests and curiosities. isn't so much a stage on the stage that basically they can get the hell out of the way. Once they have primed students to be interested and go, remove yourself, right? And let's see what happens. So I don't think it's an either or, but if you were choosing, I'd lean towards like build a curriculum that accentuates the skills you know they're going to have to use in life. And as a long time, I'll just pick on my topic, teacher of history. A lot of time I was teaching stuff that I couldn't sit there and say, I really think this is high utility for them. And that bothered me. And I don't think I'm alone in that among the teaching kind of population out there.
Yeah, that's really difficult actually, because that really undermines your sense of meaning and purpose, and also to some extent your integrity as well in a
Yes.
kind of classroom setting, because
Yeah.
you're having to kind of pretend that this is really important and you're trying to create meaning out of something where
Yep.
there are other aspects perhaps of history that could be more meaningful to the young people
Yeah.
and more applicable in their lives. So yeah.
And see that like that. So that's a good example, because that's where the both and can come in, right? Because so somebody in your audience, a teacher might listen and say, well, there's a point in life where you just have to do stuff you don't want to do, and you just have to be disciplined. And I totally agree. And I think I've mentioned that multiple times in the conversation. How do you learn distress tolerance and the ability to navigate adversity and unpleasantness and be resilient and all those sorts of things? But, John and I do a lot of work for the Flow Research Collective, and our executive director, I think, has always framed this really well. Like for the teacher that says, I got to help my kids learn to be gritty. Yes. And the easiest way to do that is through the stuff they love. Mm-hmm. They're just going to be more willing to be disciplined and control their distractions and learn all of those skills if you start with something they dig in the first place, right? Kind of a funny case in point, but I have a little niece, 5 years old, love her to death. She just started playing football, and we went and watched her game, and, kind of running around and sometimes pausing, sometimes running, picking daisies, that sort of thing. Super cute. And the next night was Halloween night, right? So there was no daisy picking. There was no stopping. It was sprinting nonstop for an hour from house to house to house to house. Right.
Yeah.
And so it just speaks to, I think, sort of, that the contextualization and what can happen when you pluck the right strings and right triggers for a young person, right? You're going to see a totally different motivational profile.
Absolutely. And what's so lovely about that is that can form habits. And actually, then when they do hit something that isn't as exciting and isn't something they love as much, they've actually got those habits where they can sit down, they can remove distractions, they can really focus. When it gets uncomfortable, they can keep persisting and keep going through that. So I think really advantageous, because certainly in the UK, our syllabus is dictated. And so where we can have some flexibility around that, where we can make it more relevant, more meaningful, more exciting, more engaging, and that can then hopefully build the habits that enable us to demonstrate those great kind of performance and intellectual virtues that you talked about.
Yeah, absolutely. 100%.
And I'm super curious as well, because if you look at the Jubilee Center for Character and Virtues framework, they also talk about moral and civic virtues as being really important for a flourishing life and a flourishing society. Where do you think they fit in the curriculum?
Man, what a question right now, right? So, I mean, just to give you a bit of context, I had 3 teaching certifications initially coming out of undergrad. And the third one was the academic study of religions. The second one was social sciences. So, I like culture. I like diversity. I like thinking about philosophy and religion and values and kicks, right? So all of that's super interesting to me. And in a public community setting, I see why people think it is not a school's place to talk about, determine, or dictate those, right? Mm-hmm. And I am hesitant to count on everyone in the society trying to instill those values, right? Mm-hmm. And I think you would see in not that there shouldn't be diverse values and ideas and opinions, right? But I think for healthy groups to function in a healthy way, there should be some sort of agreement or alignment around those core values, right? You can see this in all sorts of different settings, business settings, team settings, right? Whatever it might be. So let's set that aside for a second. Let's say you have alignment, right? Mm-hmm. Then it's critical.
Mhm.
It's got to be a part of, I think, early education, especially. And you know, we can talk about different models, but I do a lot of work for the Shipley School, right? They start working on virtues and character in their lower school, I think, as early as kindergarten, right? Plastered all over the place. Because when it comes to almost everything else, perception of reality, psychological flexibility, emotional agility, discipline, all those sorts of things, there are very serious, reputable, well-researched techniques like acceptance commitment that would say what it all comes back to is values. Values aligned behavior, right? And so even if we can't all agree, I think it's critical for a young person or any human being to identify and know what theirs are in a way that can determine, right, future action, habit building, all the things that we've been talking about, right? How do you do that? When do you do that? Right? Is a trickier sort of question. But if you're just asking like, what's the case? I think the case is very strong.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that. And what's really interesting is that we do a lot of work around values through coaching and
Yeah.
leadership training and things like that. And it's almost never that a young person would have a value that damages society. It's nearly always virtues that they're talking about. It's kindness, it's love, it's honesty, it's fairness, it's justice that they're talking about that they really value. So I guess it's enabling them to actually live out those values and creating the environment like you talked about. And I guess the curriculum that allows them to really explore those values and celebrate those values. So whenever I teach geography, so it's really helpful to really think about things through a slightly ethical lens. So if you're talking about energy production, or we were talking about the future of food, and actually really digging into the ethics of what's going on and what's the impact beyond just the immediate location, but actually what's the global impact of choices that people are making around food production or around energy production or climate change or whatever. So yeah, super opportunity for that.
Yeah, and I think that topics like that are really good examples to me, and also why the community or the school, I think, really needs to be not exactly on the same page, right? Like that diversity is a real strength, I think, but somewhat closely aligned. Because if you take something like the VIA survey, right? So I love some of Ryan's notions around overusing and underusing strengths, right? So you take something like sustainability or climate or planet, stuff that, let's call them somewhat political topic, right? And you talk about that through the lens of curiosity, which is one of those VIA strengths, right? Well, you can underuse curiosity and just stay locked into your sort of position, confirmation bias, disconfirmation bias, echo chambers, all those sorts of things. You also can overuse it and say, well, I'm kind of open to the different opinions or perspectives, right? And so to me, it's not just what are the characters or virtues that we as a community think are important, but how do we talk about them in a nuanced way that helps a young person dial in what that sweet spot looks like, right? And understand how it shifts by context, right? Like, we're not just, a good example is, do you have kids, Katie?
Yeah.
How old?
12 boys.
Okay. All right. So honesty, right? Are they globally honest or dishonest, or are they honest or dishonest depending on the context and circumstances?
Oh, both. Definitely. Depending on the child. One of them is unbelievably honest. He has a lot of other kind of vices, but honesty is not one of them. And he'll be like, yeah, I did that. Yeah, that's totally me, however bad it is.
So that's a good example, right? Like, would you potentially characterize that as overusing honesty?
Not yet, but it could be, because there is the potential to, and actually, yeah, he does overuse honesty, because occasionally he will criticize others in a way that isn't helpful. It's not kind. It's not promoting growth opportunities. It's just not that kind. So yeah, that's
so that it's a perfect example.
Yeah,
yeah, how important context is. Yeah,
totally. Yeah, I love that. Very very positive. And I guess that speaks to phronesis and getting this wisdom. And I love Aristotle's golden mean. So like actually finding where is the midpoint of all of these strengths. And I think that for sure Seligman and Peterson were quite influenced by ancient philosophy in their creation of the VIA character strengths, because they were talking about character, and you can see that coming through quite strongly. So something like courage, you don't want to overuse that and become reckless, but you don't want to be timid about things either. And you can really look at that in a kind of curriculum classroom context as well, which is really interesting. So yeah, quite fun to really, again, like you say, there's so much nuance to anything that you do in education. It really takes a lot of phronesis and wisdom to pick your way through it. I guess it speaks to the fact that you've got to give teachers time to think about things deeply and not just tell them, teach this, give us a load of data, make sure it's done, and get ready for, we have Ofsted inspections or ISI inspections in the UK. So actually giving them a bit of time to really think deeply and think together in community about these kind of issues.
That's attention too. You know, I've been on both sides of that, kind of the observation, evaluation, and being observed, you know, and evaluated, those sorts of things. And it's tough because you're right. You want to give, I think, like, there's a tension there when we understand the importance of autonomy, right? And intrinsic motivation and growth mindset and focusing on processes, but the system is not designed for those sorts of things, right? So there's a lot of schools that are like, how do we try to give teachers that sort of space and the things that we know matter, but also make sure like they have their stuff together and they're delivering good lessons and that we have some sense of what's going on and accountability to the parents who are giving their children to us every single day, right? Again, a complex challenge, I think.
Yeah, it's quite a narrow path, but one that's so important to think about and not just kind of, I suppose, be reactive to, but actually to really think carefully about how much autonomy can we give teachers, because we really understand the importance of that to their well-being, their engagement, and their ability to be creative and exciting and effective in the classroom, and then balance that with, you have to get them through the syllabus. There is no way around it, because they'll come to the end and take their GCSEs, and if they haven't covered the syllabus because you're talking about exciting moral questions or spending too long on skills, that's a bit problematic as well. So your thoughts. Where have you seen it done well? Where have you seen flourishing and well-being integrated effectively into a curriculum?
Not sure that I have.
Yeah, not yet.
Well, here, let me distinguish. Depends on what we mean by well. Right? I don't presume to have the answers. And at the same time, I'm going to say that I'm pretty confident we haven't really gotten anywhere close to what it could be, right? And I don't mean for that to be pointing the finger at schools or teachers or anything like that. I think it is largely a systemic issue and challenge, right? But the reality of the matter for me, working with a lot of different schools in a lot of different ways that are in these spaces, is no one's getting off the train tracks, right? That this system has them going down, right? They're, you know, maybe changing directions, taking different routes, but there's still kind of this emphasis on, and I get it, I understand the rationale, but performance and metrics and identifying certain people that can do certain things in certain ways and go on to university or whatever else it might be. But I think if we're really going to talk about embedding flourishing, then the entire structure of what we do, why we do it, and how we do it needs to shift dramatically. So, you know, I think the Shipley School obviously does, I think, as good a job as anybody. They have an entire separate curriculum, so not necessarily integrated, but separate curriculum called SEED, Social, Emotional, Ethical Development, that covers a lot of this stuff, K through 12. Obviously, I think we're both big fans of places like, well, you know, where Geelong Grammar got us started, but now it's, you know, primarily happening through Justin Robinson and David Bott. I think Dubai College and Mark Samways, I think, is doing a lot of interesting stuff that, you know, we know a lot of the same people, I think, in these spaces. And so a lot of folks making the effort, despite the challenge of, you know, the systemic or ecosystemic sort of box around them, right?
Yeah, they're kind of stretching it where they can and working within that box in really clever ways, which is really exciting to see. And if you're, say you're a head of department and you're designing a curriculum, what advice would you give to someone for overcoming the barriers? Like, how could they make the best possible job of it, given the barriers that are in place?
Yeah. so much of what I think we see in flourishing, you brought up Harvard's measure, right? So how does Harvard talk about its measure in ways that I think are a little different than Penn's? And I've had
Yeah.
this conversation with Matt Lee, former director of empirical research, right? Who we both know really well and love. And when he was on a previous podcast I did, we pushed the achievement piece or the lack thereof, right? So listeners, Harvard's model doesn't have achievement engagement flow in it. Super interesting, especially for a place like Harvard, right? So what he talked about there was the first time I had heard it really phrased that way, but we talk about it all the time now, that those components on Harvard's measures are ends in and of themselves, right?
Yes.
Whereas achievement is more like a means or a pathway.
Mm-hmm.
So if I'm leading a department, the first question I would have for my faculty and my teachers is, what are the ends that are worth doing and pursuing in and of themselves,
Yes.
right? And I say that because telling anyone, let alone a young person, that you need to do this because you'll need it next year, or because you'll need it in 5 years, or because you need it in 10 years, might have some utility, but that also puts an immediate motivational ceiling in place.
Yep.
Right? It's just only going to go so far. So how do you tap into those intrinsically rewarding, this is worth doing for its own sake sort of experiences? Because tapping into those is going to be what's going to get the kid to come back more and more, which is going to lead to that broaden and build and skill acquisition and desire to be grittiness and those sorts of things, right? That's where I would start. What is the true goal or ends? And if it ain't, math teacher, if it ain't that every kid can do Pythagorean's theorem, okay, fine. If you have to cover, because the state mandates it, Pythagorean's theorem, figure out a way to turn it into something intrinsically aligned and self-concordant and driven so that the kid can at least get that taste out of that otherwise sort of thing they're doing just out of compliance, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's such a great example, because so often we can switch what's mandated to make it more relevant and make it applicable in their lives and relevant to their lives, and something that they could connect with and see the utility and value of longer term. Yeah. And I think your point on what are the ends is such a brilliant question to start with. Like, when you're designing a curriculum, what is the purpose of this? What is the end that we're hoping for? Is such a brilliant place to start, and flipping it from there, because then you can bring the barriers in afterwards. But rather than starting with the barriers and constraints, really thinking, what's possible, and going from there. Amazing. Nick, have you got anything else that you would like to say on education or flourishing? Or
well, not necessarily education or flourishing, but I'll just kind of dovetail off what you mentioned there. I think it's worth bringing up that a lot of times changing experiences, right, for students is sometimes as simple as just changing perception.
yes.
Right. So when you can't always control changing the actual experience itself for whatever reasons, right, whatever confines, constraints, or just real rational reasons why you wouldn't, you often can get access, but just changing perception, right? Helping a kid connect to the material in a different way, helping them connect to you, which might make them want to work a little harder, right? But just shifting experience so that they're seeing different possibilities, right? So for your listeners that are maybe feeling constrained or, pigeonholed, only can do so much, there's a lot of power in shifting perception and mindset and attitude.
Yeah, what a place to bring it to a close. And I think Viktor Frankl, so do read Man's for Meaning, is really the gold standard on that. But actually, Professor Andrew Huberman, he's a neurobiologist and ophthalmologist at Stanford. He actually demonstrates how when we shift our perception, we change our entire brain and body chemistry. And so on a neurological level, we can absolutely transform our motivation. For all the scientists out there, you can feel confident with that as well.
Yeah, it's worth mentioning his episode with Aaliyah Crum goes into a really nice deep dive with that. He has a handful of episodes that get into some of that, but the one with Dr. Crum is particularly useful, I think, for teachers or just people thinking about stress, motivation, mindset in general.
Brilliant. And any just final message for the teachers and educators and other interested people who care about education and flourishing? Have you got any messages for them?
Yeah, I mean, this is a me and we thing, I think, right? So we've talked a lot about flourishing for young people. I spent 12 years at the largest Jewish day school in the United States, right? So shout out Milken Community Schools. And there's a line from Ethics of the Fathers, right? If I'm not for myself, who will be for me? If I'm only for myself, what am I? And teachers, I think by nature are givers. That has a sweet spot, right? You can take giving too far, right, to the point of burnout. And so I would say one of the ways to try to make sure you're best positioned to help your people flourish is to make sure you are positioned to help yourself flourish.
Beautiful message, Nick. Thank you so much for this really inspiring, absolutely fascinating and deeply insightful interview. I've really loved talking to you. And yeah, look forward to catching up again soon. Nick, thank you so much.
That was my pleasure, Katie. Thanks for having me. Great to reconnect and chat with you. And yeah, we'll do it again soon. Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much, Nick. Bye.
Bye.